The US and Israel are subjecting Iran to systematic and heavy bombing. The scale of the assault is striking. The US is using roughly a third of its global fleet of attack aircraft, while Israel has committed almost its entire strike capability. Yet the strategy behind the campaign is oddly unclear. Each week I look at one major international event and try to explain the structures of power behind it, the actors, ideologies, and assumptions shaping events. Looking at the tactics and political context, several things about this war already stand out. The event. As ever in conflict, the military tactics tell their own story. This is a massive assault. Iran is getting a pounding, but it is only a single country, and Israel and the US may only be able to sustain the attacks for a few weeks. This is clearly devastating for Iran, but would not be for much larger countries like, for instance, Russia or China, who are no doubt taking note. The attacks are also hugely and unsustainably expensive, at nearly $1 billion per day, and more if you include the cost of replacing Israeli munitions, doubtless in the tens of billions of dollars, a cost which, as usual, will fall to the American taxpayer. The targets of the bombing seem to be very widespread. Nuclear sites, regime centers, anti-aircraft sites, missile launchers comprised the targets of the early waves of the bombing. Israel is now also bombing Iran's infrastructure, its oil infrastructure, storage tanks, refineries, etc. We don't know everything that they're bombing, and we may never. Neither Israel, the US, nor Iran have much incentive to publicize this. The breadth of this range of targets indicates that the objective goes well beyond regime change or destroying Iran's nuclear or missile capabilities. The aim instead seems to be to bring Iran to its knees and keep it there for a good while. This is not, of course, the declared objective either of Israel or the US. This strategy is indicative of the Israeli tactic tastelessly known as mowing the grass, the regular destruction of enemy capabilities to reduce and contain potential threats, whether from Hezbollah, Iran, or Hamas. Iran's economy is already very weak. Destroying its infrastructure, particularly its oil infrastructure, will weaken the country further. If a new regime were to come to power, it will have a very tough time. Iran's people are condemned to long-term hardship, come what may. US defensive actions have included the interception of Iranian missiles targeting Iranian Kurdish forces, suggesting that a US tactic is indeed to support the Kurds against the regime, as has been speculated. However, the idea that Kurdish forces might be used to topple the regime is absurd. Those forces are tiny, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 strong. Iran's army and security forces are perhaps 1 to 2 million strong. The Kurds are geographically isolated in a corner of northwest Iran, and many are outside Iran, based in northern Iraq. This is nothing comparable to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when Kurdish Peshmerga forces were mobilized in the north to form a kind of second front against the Saddam regime, a strategy which had significant impact in the overall conflict, though in that case the Kurds were fighting alongside US special forces who were on the ground. Furthermore, very recent history in Syria has savagely demonstrated that the US is an unreliable ally for the Kurds. Only a few weeks ago, the US abandoned the largely Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, their former allies, in favor of the al-Sharaa government in Damascus, in spite of the cooperation between the US and SDF in the over 12-year war against ISIS at the cost of the lives of more than 11,000 Kurdish and Arab SDF fighters. US support for the Iranian Kurds does, however, point to a lack of planning in Washington for any kind of plausible regime change strategy, a deficit for which there is plenty of other evidence. So what's going on inside the system? US military attacks are usually long planned and allies are forewarned. This is not the case with Trump. While the US military build-up in the Gulf lasted for several weeks before the attacks took place, there was, it appears, little or no coordination or warning for allies, except of course Israel. One way of looking at this war, therefore, is as US unilateralism, a US that does not seek and does not care about building alliances. This is very different from the 1991 or 2003 wars against Iraq, when a great deal of diplomatic effort, both wooing and bullying, was expended by the US to recruit countries to join the coalition, even if sometimes their participation was merely nominal. This also underlines again that the US cares little about international legitimacy and cannot be bothered even to pretend it does. George Bush offered specific and argued legal justification in 2003, even if the argument, invented by the UK, in fact, was totally spurious. Today, the US has only loosely referred to its right of self-defense against persistent Iranian attacks. This touches on the UK debate about the legal justification of possible British involvement in the attacks. Lord Wolfson, the Conservative Shadow Attorney General, argued that the attacks could be defined as self-defense against imminent attack, and that therefore UK forces should have joined in. This argument, like America's legal justification, does not hold water. There is no evidence of an imminent Iranian attack, and an attack must be very imminent to fulfill this criterion of legality, which is, in any case, very weak. Instead, the usual formulae of the legality of war apply. Military action must be either in self-defense, i.e. your territory has been attacked, not you think it might be attacked on some day in the future, or authorized by the UN Security Council. In this case, neither was true. Meanwhile, the British government has judged the attacks unlawful, though not the subsequent defensive actions necessitated by Iran's own retaliatory attacks in self-defense. There has been much mention of the lessons of the 2003 Iraq War and even the Chilcot Inquiry, the official public inquiry into the war. This is all very gratifying to someone who testified to Chilcot about the illegality and lies of that war. But the UK has already done its worst to the rules-based order by its disgraceful complicity in the Gaza genocide and indeed by invading Iraq in 2003. The US also does not care much about explaining itself at the UN. Its statements there are inconsistent, on the one hand mentioning dismantling Iran's nuclear program as the objective, but also self-defense. It's striking that there has been almost zero attention to that discussion at the UN, for instance at the UN Security Council. US indifference to the UN appears to be contagious. Likewise, international criticism of the assault has been very muted. There is a rote feeling to Russian and Chinese condemnations, for instance. One explanation is widespread deference to the US. Perhaps a more plausible explanation is that no one cares enough about Iran to put their heads above the parapet and invite American retaliation. Iranian diplomacy has been a comprehensive failure. What's everyone getting wrong about this war? This may be a predominantly American operation, but it is an Israeli war. There is no question that but for Israel, the US would not be attacking Iran. Netanyahu has badgered the US to attack Iran for many years. He succeeded last June in the 12-day war when the US and Israel extensively bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. Trump then claimed that Iran's nuclear capability had been obliterated in that attack. Yet here they are doing it again. Israel now seems to have a very biddable ally in Washington who is willing to expend considerable American military force, money and lives in support of Israel's security. The claim that Iran threatens US security or interests is ridiculous. Iran threatens Israel. Iran is many years from fielding an intercontinental ballistic missile that might hit the US, and why on earth would it use such a suicidal weapon? Amid the cacophony of Washington's many explanations for the war, you may have caught Marco Rubio's early justification that the US was taking preemptive action against Iranian attacks that would follow Israel's planned bombing, which the US was told to expect, and that therefore the US attacks against Iran were defensive. A more convoluted explanation is hard to imagine, but it is also unwittingly indicating the real instigator. Given the almost random and constantly changing array of explanations he has offered, it seems likely that Trump has no clear idea of the objective, except some vague and grandiose idea of repeating the Maduro kidnap decapitation operation in Venezuela, a theory supported by his ludicrous suggestion that he alone decide the next supreme leader in Iran. Moreover, as noted, one consistent theme of why the bombing is happening is already pretty clear, i.e. the pursuit of Israeli security, as defined by Israel. As usual, there is a lot of talk about Iran's nuclear program, as if it is a given that Iran is on the verge of deploying a nuclear weapon. This too is one of the justifications offered by Israel and the US. It's a claim that's reinforced by statements by the UK, France, Germany, etc., that Iran must not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons, a formulation that seems to be designed to reassure the US of their support for the objective of ending the nuclear program, even if they are not participating in the military operation, a kind of diplomatic having your cake and eating it, or, as Trump might see it, free riding. The US and Israel are far from reliable sources on the extent or progress of Iran's nuclear weapons program, as their many contradictory and exaggerated claims over the years have demonstrated. There is in truth no fully reliable source, perhaps not surprising for a secret program, and a reality that may be allowing Iran to pursue a kind of keep 'em guessing strategy, much as Saddam apparently encouraged his enemies to think that he did have weapons of mass destruction capability when in fact he didn't. If that is the case, the Iranian strategy has not worked. But as usual, few commentators have mentioned that in the Oman-hosted talks with the US that preceded this war, Iran reportedly offered to limit its uranium enrichment program to only 3.6% enrichment, which is down from the current 60%, and weapons-grade enrichment needs to be 90%. And that Iran would send its current stockpile of 400 kilograms of enriched uranium, which, by the way, US and Israeli targeted but admitted they did not destroy last year, to send this pile of enriched uranium overseas, i.e. get rid of it, and suspend all enrichment for several years. In other words, an acceptable diplomatic and peaceful solution was in fact available. These terms are not far off those agreed with the US under Obama and the other P5 countries plus Germany in 2015 as part of the so-called JCPOA, an agreement that the first Trump administration withdrew from. It's reasonable to assume that further negotiations now would have produced tighter controls, perhaps analogous to those in the JCPOA, or better. The JCPOA took over a year and a half to negotiate. This time the US allowed a few days for discussion. We can conclude, therefore, that the quote-unquote failure of negotiations was a mere pretext, the talks themselves a sham. It appears that the US and Israel were intent on war, whatever concessions Iran offered at the talks. Other countries that might one day be offered negotiations when facing threatened American military assault, such as North Korea or indeed Denmark, might want to take note. The strategy of pre-planned and deliberate and unprovoked attack is consistent with Israel's post-October 7th military posture, which is to annihilate all potential threats before they become a threat, taking preemption to a whole new level. This doctrine is also apparent in Israel's repeated and unprovoked bombing of supposed Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, including Beirut, and its illegal and seemingly now permanent occupation of a swathe of southern Syria, which continues to attract zero international attention, let alone criticism, just like Israel's continuing and apparently ceaseless bombing of Gaza. This observation about Israeli strategy is not speculation. Israeli ministers have announced it. What should we watch for to see where things are heading? Trump and his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, have occasionally started saying that the war is won, but they have offered no more evidence of the destruction of Iranian nuclear or missile capabilities than they did in the 12-day war. But what matters is what they say rather than what actually has been done, not least because, helpfully for them, it is impossible for the public or press to judge the real extent of damage inflicted by the bombing. Interestingly, at the time of this video, Israel has not said the same, perhaps pointing to a divergence over when to stop bombing. But once the American statements of victory start to come thicker and faster, we can hope that they presage the cessation of the war. By the same token, the absence of such statements will indicate the continuation. The longer the war goes on, the more that America's allies in the Gulf, Europe or elsewhere will press, at first in private, then more loudly, for it to end because of the very negative effects for them, including on oil prices. Trump has particular financial interests in the Gulf. Qatar gave him a 747, so he may pay attention at least to their pressure. The UAE in particular seems to have been hit disproportionately by Iran. Well over 1,000 missiles or drones have been launched at the UAE. It's not really clear why. I don't agree with those who say that Iran's strategy to target the Gulf and other neighbouring countries is a failure. Much of the pressure on the US to end the war will come from those states, who are paying a significant price for US-Israeli attacks. Dubai will never seem the same again. China, which imports more than 70% of its oil, may also be exerting behind-the-scenes pressure, which is not insignificant. Do not expect regime change, even if it remains a possibility, for the reasons I described in my last post on Substack. More likely is the dogged continuation of the current regime, for whom merely not losing will be presented as a kind of victory. The appalling violence meted out by the Iranian state against protesters in January suggests that a popular uprising would be viciously repressed, and there is yet, perhaps as a consequence, no sign of such an uprising. The only hope, therefore, would be some kind of internal coup perpetrated by disaffected officers from the army or Republican Guard or other kind of regime insiders. The outcome of such a takeover is, of course, like all possibilities in this turbulent situation, totally unpredictable, and is as plausibly bad as much as good. The deeper current. What are the long-term forces shaping the situation? American and Israeli technological advantage in waging war, particularly from the air, has again been proven to be overwhelming. But note that this campaign is against a weak adversary, armed mainly with very out-of-date equipment. Iran has almost no air force to speak of, though its air defense missiles are fairly modern Russian systems. But illustrating yet again the power of insurgent-style asymmetric tactics, Iran has discomfited Gulf countries and even Cyprus by launching hundreds of very cheap and easy-to-manufacture Shahed drones, compared by one analyst to toy aeroplanes. As Ukraine also has shown, ingenuity can go some way in taking on scale. One side note here, as The Economist has reported, the US has used a new type of non-nuclear missile in this war that would have been prohibited under the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, INF agreement, between the US and Russia that has been allowed to expire by both parties. This is one material indicator of the more general and concerning decay of the global arms control regime, which I wrote about in my Substack a few weeks ago. International law is not revived by a few Europeans belatedly declaring its importance in this case. Unlike compulsory domestic law enforced by the state, international law is a long-term normative and shared understanding that is given force not only by present-day declaration, but also by historical memory. It is held up above all by the powerful choosing to respect it, cite it, and demand it consistently and over time. And with this war, these fragile norms have suffered another body blow. The world is thus more dangerous for all of us. The putative bolstering of Israel's security through unlawful violence comes at a more general cost of weakening the security of everyone else. Just as I argued in the Syria case, the US remains the regional hegemon in the Middle East. Its military power and political sway continue to dominate without challenge of any kind, whether political or military. But the question too remains, why does the US give such extraordinary attention and resources to this single region? There's a simple answer: Israel. Israel's influence over American foreign and military policy continues to far outweigh Israel's size, importance, or significance to broader American interests, but that influence may well have peaked. Opinion polls show that for the first time more Americans are sympathetic to the Palestinian side than the Israeli. More and more mainstream politicians and commentators are choosing to criticize Israel, hitherto a no-go zone in US political debate. Israel's influence is not just down to the Israel lobby, it is also a function of the powerful constituency of evangelical Christians. To non-Americans, the power of this group is surprising. There is no equivalent in largely atheist Europe, for instance. After the attacks of 9/11, George Bush declared a crusade in the Middle East. Criticism of this statement quickly caused him to withdraw this provocative term. No such restraint today applies to the rhetoric or tattoos of Hegseth, who has, for instance, described Iran as hell-bent on prophetic Islamist delusions, America's freedoms as God-given, and whose body is tattooed with religious iconography, including a large Jerusalem cross used by the Crusaders on his chest, and Deus vult, or God wills it, a Crusader battle cry inscribed, appropriately enough, on his bicep. Some American commanders, following Hegseth's lead, have told their troops that the Iran campaign is all part of God's divine plan, and have cited the Book of Revelation and Armageddon. But the US choice to fight Israel's war may be as simple as Netanyahu somehow getting Trump to do his bidding. But how? What did he offer him? What has he got over him? Every diplomat in DC, at least, would like to know. The deep racism of American military policy is revealed yet again by the consideration or lack of it given to Iranian lives. Imagine if 160 white Serbian schoolchildren had been killed by NATO bombing in 1999. This is the number of Iranian children the US has apparently killed at a school in southern Iran. There would be outrage and a huge chorus demanding the end of the war, both among politicians and on the street. By contrast, today in the media or among politicians, there is no mention of Iranian lives as a limiting factor in the war, that perhaps the war should stop in order to preserve them. There is a grotesque hypocrisy in referencing the Iranian regime's recent slaughter of protesters as an indicator of its cruelty, while taking yet more lives by means of aerial bombing, which is claimed as precisely targeted, but is clearly often indiscriminate. The lives of others, as ever, seem low on the list of the war makers' priorities. Even if security is top of that list, we seem to be talking only about the security of some, not of others. Indeed, the malleable and typically undefined notion of security continues to be put into service to justify war waged by the state. It's interesting that this term is never, or is only very rarely used by non-state actors of any kind, for it seems to be about some abstract notion of the security of the state for political leaders or diplomats to define, rather than the lives of actual people. There is a further layer to this. The fact that security can be defined in many and varied ways gives great room and sway to those doing the defining, in other words, political leaders. Tony Blair mendaciously claimed that Iraq threatened Britain's security in 2003, when his real motive was giving blanket support to a bellicose America bent on post-9/11 revenge, anywhere, anyhow. Today, Trump and Netanyahu allege that their own country's security is at stake. They claim to speak for the state, and indeed, constitutionally, their voters have so ordained them. But do they really? It's very easy to see that each of them has concealed motives of pure and cynical self-interest. Trump's to evade the spreading Epstein scandal, and Netanyahu to secure his political survival with the blood of others, whether Palestinian, Lebanese, or Iranian. Thus, the final question: why do we give these people the power to define what the state needs or wants? Why do we even accept the notion, a grotesque manufacture, that there is such a thing as requirements or interests of the state that are somehow distinct from the needs, bodies, and lives of real bleeding people? One day, I trust, this false construction will be regarded as an excuse for killing or dying, no more justifiable than killing for a king, a barrel of oil, or a crucifix. Thank you. You can see more of my analysis on my Substack, which is free to subscribe to. Thank you.